Ruins and more ruins. Incessant bombings leave rubble scattered everywhere, buildings destroyed or about to collapse. This is Berlin, the city that had been chosen by Adolf Hitler to become the emblem of the Third Reich, a regime that would last 1,000 years. The Second World War is about to end. The Führer has just died knowing that his dream will never come true. The first week of May 1945 has passed, and the Nazis finally surrender. However, the hardships of the population in the German capital have only just begun. In this new military history video, we will discover how the fierce conflict brought the city of Berlin to ruin and made millions of people suffer, some who could tell it and others who could not. Together, we will walk through its shattered streets wrapped in the flames of pain. "12 years before the fall of Berlin, on January 30th, 1933, Adolf Hitler became the new Chancellor of Germany. That day, a new and dark chapter in history began to be written. The leader of the Third Reich had many ideas for his government, but they all followed the same goal: rebuilding an empire. The Führer was sure that he would succeed, and also that his regime would last 1,000 years. His task would be to lay the foundations for a new world in which the Germans of the Aryan race would be the undisputed kings. To do this, he hoped to create an important emblem that would commemorate his enormous victory. He called it Germania, and it would be the capital of the 1,000-year Reich. However, the place really existed, and it was nothing more and nothing less than Berlin, only the city would undergo a gigantic transformation. The project was conceived by Hitler himself and his favorite architect, Albert Speer, who was in charge of the reconstruction of the monumental Chancellery building. In fact, the initiative would follow a similar path to this one, in terms of the ideas of reflecting the vision of a powerful and dominant Germany, with ostentatious materials and structures in the style of the Roman Empire. Some of the Nazi leader's dreams came to light, and he went so far as to state to the people that Berlin, as a world capital, would only be comparable to the cities of ancient Egypt or Rome. One of the ideas to achieve this goal was the Great Hall of the People. It was a work that included an immense dome that would be the largest building in the world. It was inspired by St. Peter's Basilica in Rome and would house more than 180,000 people. The structure would be 250 meters high, something incredible for that time. On the other hand, Hitler also planned to build a giant Arc de Triomphe, much larger than the one in Paris, to commemorate the victories of the Third Reich. This would be 117 meters high and would be another symbol of Nazi greatness. The buildings would be built of marble and other durable materials, symbolizing the permanence of the regime. The monumental structures were joined by squares and open areas, designed to serve as mass gathering places for party events, ceremonies, and parades. Now, although some preliminary projects began with the construction of scale models and the preparation of some land, the armed conflict soon absorbed the resources of the German government, and priority was placed on the war machine. Suddenly, Hitler's expansionist desires put a stop to his ostentatious dreams of transforming Berlin. However, the devastation of the Second World War would soon knock on the doors of the capital. The German capital was the final objective of Nazism's rivals. Adolf Hitler himself spent his last days there, locking himself in the bunker of the Reich Chancellery, while the Allies advanced on the Western Front and the Red Army from the Eastern Front. All this caused the last battle of the war in Europe to take place precisely in Berlin. The city that had been thought of by the Führer as the emblem of the New World would be nothing more than the scene of his defeat. The fighting took place mainly in April 1945, with days of intense and desperate fighting by the regime seeking to resist the Soviet onslaught. After the clashes on the outskirts, on April 16th, the Red Army forces launched a massive attack to capture the capital. From the east, north, and south, Stalin's troops advanced rapidly, surrounding the city. The Führer and his high command ordered the territory to be defended at all costs, and a force was formed with the men available. There were soldiers from the Wehrmacht and the SS, but also members of the Hitler Youth and the Volkssturm, a militia made up of children and the elderly. Without a doubt, this was clear evidence that the Nazis were playing their last card with the only thing they had left. As if that were not enough, all of them were poorly equipped and outnumbered by the enemy. However, they fought fiercely for their flag until the last moment. None of this prevented the enemy from advancing with their plan. The Allies' participation came from the air, with brutal bombings that shook the entire city. Buildings began to collapse and flames invaded the streets. Meanwhile, the Soviets advanced with heavy artillery fire towards Berlin. On April 25, 1945, they managed to finally surround the city. There, intense street fighting became more frequent, as did house-to-house confrontations in the search for hidden Nazis. 5 days later, one of the most important events of the conflict took place. Adolf Hitler finally accepted that the battle was lost, and he knew that if he fell into the hands of the Red Army, his fate would be the cruelest torture. Before that could happen, he chose to take his own life in his bunker and demanded that his men burn his remains. After the Führer's death, the German defense began to crumble rapidly. However, some sectors of the city continued to comply with Hitler's last order, offering desperate resistance. The fighting continued until May 2nd, when General Helmuth Weidling, commander in Berlin, ordered the unconditional surrender of the city. By then, the capital was already terribly devastated. The fall of Berlin was a crucial step towards the end of World War II in Europe. On May 8, 1945, a week after declaring defeat, Germany signed the unconditional surrender, officially marking the end of the war. The dream of that glorious city, emblem of the thousand-year Reich, turned into a nightmare. Everything was chaos and blood. The collapse of the Nazi regime swept the capital away, reducing it to a huge pile of rubble. The destruction was massive. 70% of Berlin was in ruins. Many residential areas were completely flattened, and the few buildings that remained still bore the brunt of the war. The Battle of Berlin also left thousands of lives lost. A large number of civilians were killed by bombing and street fighting. Those who were a little luckier, if that can be called good fortune, were forced to cope with the living conditions that followed the war. In the weeks immediately following the end of World War II, the city's population was faced with a number of extreme problems. Subsistence became the greatest challenge in the face of widespread destruction. The intense artillery fire had not only devastated residential buildings, but also a large part of the infrastructure, including hospitals and public service providers. Many people were killed or trapped in the rubble, while those who were able to be rescued found a health system that had collapsed. Health facilities had been razed or had run out of staff and supplies. The lack of adequate medical care meant that injuries and illnesses, both physical and mental, could not be treated. The unsanitary conditions of a city in ruins also contributed to the situation worsening by the minute. One example of this was the large numbers of Berliners who took refuge in basements, bunkers, or partially destroyed buildings, often in overcrowded conditions. Lack of ventilation, humidity, and poor hygiene contributed to the spread of illness. The war was over, and the rumble of bombs was no longer the main concern, but the devastation continued to plague citizens day after day. In this context, another major problem was the lack of food. With the capital surrounded by the Soviets for long weeks and supply routes cut off, food and other basic goods were extremely scarce. Rationing was not enough for the entire population, and many civilians went hungry. Searching for food scraps amid the rubble became a daily task. Adding to this was the disruption of water supplies in many regions, forcing citizens to rely on contaminated sources or take risks to obtain water in military-controlled areas. There was no doubt that the city and all of Germany had reached its most critical point.
It's really in 1945 that the German economy collapses, if you like, across the finish line of defeat into something close to complete disintegration at this point. This is the moment at which millions of Germans actually face starvation, the kind of starvation which they had inflicted on the rest of Europe up to that point.
These were some of the living conditions that Germans in Berlin had to face. However, this harsh reality also added to the obvious problems of most people. They had lost their homes, seeing them crumble before their eyes, leaving them without any shelter. This made them want to flee as far away as possible, although this was not easy. Firstly, the capital was not the only one that had suffered from the brutal war, so areas throughout the country were in the same conditions. On the other hand, in order to leave the city behind, Berliners had to cross a ring of ferocious enemies. Anyone willing to risk looking for food and a more dignified place to live had to face their greatest fears. Although people thought they had nothing left to lose, they were wrong. On the other hand, there was the brutality of the Soviet and Allied soldiers, who in their advance through Berlin had not hesitated to commit numerous war crimes against the refugees. The fear of looting, rape, and other abuses by the military was omnipresent. The population lived in a constant state of terror and uncertainty. The disintegration of Nazi authority and the lack of information about the future further worsened the atmosphere of chaos and despair. All of this ultimately contributed to a social and moral collapse. Without a government, law and order gradually disappeared, resulting in a state of anarchy and violence that began to dominate the streets. The recent memory of the battle and the constant bombings could not be overcome, and the mounting personal losses also caused deep psychological trauma in the population. Mental anguish was exacerbated by the lack of direction and the prevailing fear. Images of the conflict kept repeating themselves in the minds of Berliners, who could not escape one of the most terrible and dehumanizing episodes of the Second World War. Hitler's old dream of turning the city into Germania had completely collapsed, but that did not prevent Berlin from being reborn from the ashes and pain. The big difference was that it would not be the reconstruction of the great capital of the German Empire, but its destiny would be marked by 4 other countries that took control. After the war, this territory was divided into different occupation sectors, controlled by the victorious powers: the United States, the United Kingdom, France, and the Soviet Union. Each one would exert its influence on its part, but because the 3 Western countries shared the same vision, opposite to Stalin's, for practical purposes the city was divided into 2 well-defined ideologies. On one hand, East Berlin was born, also known as the capital of the German Democratic Republic. This was under the control of the Soviet Union and communism, displaying the figure of Joseph Stalin on its still destroyed streets. On the other hand, the Western countries brought their culture and ideology to West Berlin, the emblem of the Federal Republic of Germany. In this way, a new chapter of war began in the city, that of the Cold War. This had the United States and the Soviet Union as the main contenders. Both sought to extend their model around the planet, pitting American capitalism against Stalin's socialism. The presence of that struggle in the devastated German capital became evident with the construction of the Berlin Wall, which began on August 13, 1961, and symbolized the division of the city into the Eastern and Western blocks, as well as a revaluation of the objectives.
In Germany, it's about more than individual guilt. The Allies have clearly set out their political aims. They want a democratic, denazified Germany. They want to turn the self-appointed master race into peaceful neighbors.
With two distinct models, and now divided not only by ideology but also by a physical barrier, the progress of both sides of the devastated city was very different. As for West Berlin, which was located within West Germany, it received significant support in its reconstruction thanks to the Marshall Plan, an economic aid program provided by the United States to Europe after the war. This funding helped to revive the economy and carry out urban infrastructure works. The initiatives were based on a functionalist and modern approach. New buildings were built with simpler and more practical designs to meet the urgent needs of the population, such as housing, hospitals, and schools. On the other hand, some historical structures, such as the Brandenburg Gate and the Reichstag, were carefully restored as symbols of the continuity of the citizens' heritage. In addition, its main commercial avenue was also rebuilt as an emblem of prosperity. As West Germany flourished during the so-called post-war economic miracle, West Berlin experienced a revitalization. New residential neighborhoods, roads, and transportation systems were created. Meanwhile, East Berlin began to move forward under a communist regime and a different philosophy. Large projects were implemented in the socialist monumental and functional style. Karl Marx Allee, initially known as Stalin Allee, became the main axis of reconstruction. It was a wide street, lined with huge residential buildings designed in a neoclassical tone, with columns and elements reminiscent of the grandeur of the Soviet Union. The generation of homes was one of the priorities on this side of the city, given that many structures had been destroyed and the housing shortage was severe. Prefabricated apartment blocks were created to provide cheap and functional homes for the working class. East Berlin also became a showcase of Soviet power and ideals. Monuments such as the television tower were built to symbolize socialist modernity. This structure, which remains an emblem of the city, was erected as the tallest building in the German capital. Finally, Berlin began to leave the ruins of World War II behind and grew little by little. The aftermath of the enemy occupation began to fade after the fall of the wall on November 9, 1989. A year later, Germany was reunified and a new chapter in Berlin's history began. Beyond that, the pain of the conflict has left an indelible mark on the spirit of the citizens. Entire generations became accustomed to fighting day after day to get ahead, after having suffered inhuman conditions that shaped their personality over the years. Now, after having seen the devastation that the German capital suffered during the brutal conflict, it is time to say goodbye. Thank you very much for having accompanied us to the end. We look forward to seeing you again in the next military history video.